Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Warrant Officer Class 2, Michelle de Fiskbom. Today, we commemorate the creation of Australia's Navy and Army. After the Federation of Australia came into existence on the 1st of January 1901, one of the first acts of the Commonwealth Government was to create the Department of Defence, which came into being on the 1st of March 1901. On this date, the states transferred their naval and military forces to the federal government. By the following year, the two existing arms of Australia's Defence Force were recognised as the Commonwealth Naval Forces and the Commonwealth Military Forces. The Australian Army came under the command of Major General Sir Edward Hutton, who took on the task of transforming 6 colonial forces into one national Australian Army. The Australian Navy was initially constrained by belief that maritime protection was to be provided by the British Royal Navy. But steady revitalisation at the hands of the Director of Naval Forces, Captain William Creswell, and Prime Minister Alfred Deakin marked Australia's early steps towards naval and maritime independence. By 1910, the Australian Naval Defence Act provided authority for a navy no longer limited to Australian territorial waters. From these humble origins, the Royal Australian Navy and the Australian Army have established proud records of service. Many Australians have served, and some have fallen. Today, we pay our respects to the men and women commemorated here on the Roll of Honour, and to the survivors who returned home. We're honoured to acknowledge Mr. John King, representing the Returned and Services League of Australia, ACT branch. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier.
Catapult party, reverse! Catapult party, rest on!
Ladies and gentlemen, if able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catapult party, a turn! Jump! Catapult party, preserve! Out!
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts, all beauty rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains that let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Catapult party, shoulder! Out! Catapult party, order! Out!
If able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this National Museum and Memorial came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for over a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths of floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Captain Harold Dench. Harold Dench was born on the 29th of April 1887 to Henry and Rebecca Dench of Melbourne. He grew up in Camberwell, was educated at Glenferrie and Camberwell State Schools and later Camberwell Grammar School. After working for 2 different companies, Harold joined his father's firm, Henry Dench and Sons, as an auctioneer and estate agent. In 1910, his father was appointed Victorian manager of the Metropolitan Accident, Fire and General Insurance Company, and Harold Dench took over the business. He also played a prominent part in the Yarra Yarra Rowing Club, where he was variously captain and secretary. He would continue to donate money to the club to support it while he was at war. Harold had a long-standing interest in military matters and held a commission in the local citizens' militia on the outbreak of war in 1914. He applied to be transferred to the Australian Imperial Force with his current rank, but instead was sent to work as an instructor in the military camp at Bendigo. He proved popular, making many friends, but, impatient to go to war, resigned his commission in March 1916 to enlist in the Australian Imperial Force. He and 2 other militia officers who went with him hoped to qualify for a commission after arriving at the front. Dench proved such an able officer while training in Australia that he was commissioned before leaving and sailed for war in 1916 as a lieutenant in the newly formed 38th Battalion. Lieutenant Dench was first sent to England, where he was transferred to the 10th Light Trench Mortar Battery. He went to France to fight on the Western Front in November 1916 and spent the bitterly cold winter of 1916 and 1917 in or near the front line with the trench mortars. On the 31st of January 1917, the 10th Light Trench Mortar Battery was in the front line near Armentières and fired 102 rounds on a German position. During the bombardment, Dench was wounded but remained on duty. After several more months with the trench mortars, Dench returned to the 38th Battalion and in August 1917 was promoted to captain. His local newspaper reported the promotion, adding, "The hope is expressed that he may be spared to return to his native land in the full enjoyment of health and the laurels won upon the battlefield." The 38th Battalion fought in 2 major attacks during the 3rd Ypres campaign in 1917, at Broodcinder on the 4th of October and at Passchendaele on the 12th. While Broodcinder was a success, albeit with heavy casualties for the 38th Battalion, Passchendaele was a disaster. Held up by cloying mud, torrential rain and a staunch enemy defence, the battalion was unable to secure its objectives and suffered more than 60% casualties. Captain Dench was later commended for his action during this time, particularly at Broodcinder, where many of his senior officers became casualties. Dench took on a role of reorganising the 38th Battalion's position and seeing to the welfare of the men in the front line. It was noted that his courage, ability and cheerfulness under heavy fire were a great example to all. For his actions, he was mentioned in dispatches. Captain Dench suffered with bronchitis through the winter of 1917 and 1918 and spent several months in hospital in England. He returned to France in the midst of the German Spring Offensive, where the Germans made huge advances that threatened the security of the Allied line. After helping to defend against a series of German attacks, the 38th Battalion took part in the British offensive launched at Amiens on the 8th of August. The battalion went on to take part in the slow advance that followed, fighting for weeks with little rest. Captain Dench was heavily involved in the advance, and Lieutenant Colonel Hurry later wrote that he was in no small degree responsible for the splendid things that now stand to credit of the battalion. He had no fear whatever, and the example of courage and resourcefulness that he set to his company was simply invaluable. On the morning of the 24th of August 1918, the 38th Battalion was a little to the north of the French village of Bray, One flank of Dench's company was in danger of being driven back, and so he rushed forward into the open with one platoon and placed it to form a defensive flank. He then went out along and rallied the retiring troops of the unit next to his. As a result of his actions, a German attack was thwarted and the safety of the entire line secured. He was later mentioned in dispatches a second time. General W. Ramsay McNichol described the action as one of the most successful operations which has been undertaken by this brigade, largely owing to Harold's work and fine example. The position was consolidated and held under very heavy fire and against determined counterattacks. However, McNichol added, he was killed instantly by a sniper whilst rallying men, not Australians, on his flank, who, having lost their officers, were giving away. It was a most gallant action on his part, for he had to stand and direct them in the open under heavy fire, but he succeeded in rallying them before he was hit, and this act alone was of the greatest service to the brigade and indeed the whole Australian Corps. Dench's fellow officers wrote to his parents to tell him of their son's courage. The commanding officer of Charlie Company, Captain Peters, wrote, Harold was known for his cool courage, initiative and thoroughness. He was a grand leader and one who will be a big loss to our dear old 38th. Captain Harold Dench was buried near where he fell and today lies in Brayvale British Cemetery at Bracesum. He was 30 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, amongst almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. A photograph of his headstone is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Captain Harold Dench, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hopes of a better world.
Please.
Full party shoulder.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
And a full party preserve. Party shoulder.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
And a full party in words. Turn. And a full party way. Up.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you all for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.